All right, so welcome back to another video on the channel. And in today's video, I'm going to discuss whether whey protein is the most superior protein to have post-workout when your goal is to maximize hypertrophy or maximize muscle building. So if you're somebody that just wants to focus on the 20% to get the 80% outcome, the Pareto's principle, then just focus on total protein intake. Make sure you're getting at least 1.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, or around a pound or so around a gram per pound of body weight. But if you're somebody who likes the nuance and wants to get that last 5, 10, 2%, you're someone like me who's a competitive bodybuilder and want to maximize everything, then this video may be of importance to you. So before we get into it, I need to make sure that everybody understands what muscle protein synthesis is and muscle protein breakdown. So muscle protein synthesis is the synthesis of new proteins, or the acute measure of muscle building when done in a study. So muscle protein breakdown is the breakdown of proteins, the breakdown of muscle. Pretty self-explanatory. So the net difference between those two determines whether you build muscle or whether you lose muscle. Now, muscle protein breakdown isn't something that we want to completely avoid, but that's a topic for another day. So first, I'm going to get into the dynamics of muscle protein synthesis when consuming different types of protein. So that's important. And we'll look at the research, or we'll look at what the research says, and not just a single study, but the body of evidence that's out there, and then take a step back and take everything into context so that we can practically apply that and take some practical takeaways. So what we do know from research is that when you consume 20 grams of protein from whey protein isolate, you get this kind of curve of muscle protein synthesis that starts at around 45 to 90 minutes after consumption, and will peak at around 90 minutes and will last for maybe 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the study, but usually around 2 to 3 hours, and then it will come back down to baseline. When we consume 20 grams of other types of protein, such as casein protein or wheat protein, we don't get this curve that's as high. It doesn't peak as high. We don't get as high levels of muscle protein synthesis from the same amount of protein as we do from whey when we consume casein or wheat. Now, the reason behind this is simply because, one, the digestion and absorption dynamics of whey protein. So it digests quite quickly and it absorbs quite quickly in the lumen, in the small intestine. And then, of course, that also has higher levels of leucine, which you can kind of think of as the ignition for starting muscle protein synthesis. So it has higher levels per gram than casein does, or than a vegan alternative does. Also, when you think of proteins like casein protein, if you've ever had casein protein before, it's pretty like gloopy. It's quite viscous. It's almost like some sort of yogurt, and it digests quite slowly, but also doesn't have as much leucine as whey protein does. So we get this more prolonged muscle protein synthesis effect doesn't peak as high, but stays elevated for longer than whey protein. So when we're comparing 20 grams of whey protein in a fasted state, that's very important, in a fasted state, to a vegan or vegetarian alternative, or casein, which is also from milk, same as whey protein is going to be superior. However, what we do know also from research is that, this is done by Jorn Trommelen and his colleagues over in the Netherlands, is that when you consume 40 grams of whey protein, which is double the dose that we just mentioned, you only get about a 10% extra increase in muscle protein synthesis. So for whey protein, we know that somewhere between 20 and 40 grams are going to kind of maximize the muscle protein synthesis benefits from the supplement itself or the food. What we don't know is, when we consume that same amount from casein, what happens, and we haven't compared that to whey. So we do know that there's obviously a threshold or a limit where muscle protein synthesis is maximized from whey protein. We don't really know what that is from casein, because the research just hasn't been done or hasn't been funded, and nobody has kind of looked into it. Well, I'm sure people have looked into it, but nobody's carried this out as of yet and being able to kind of compare and contrast these. So We don't know. All we know is that 20 grams of whey protein in a fasted state is better than 20 grams of protein from a vegetarian alternative or vegan alternative or casein protein in terms of eliciting the maximum muscle protein synthetic response. Now, another major caveat, which I've touched on a few times, is that these studies are done in fasted states. Now, you might think that, well, why did they do that? That was silly. Well, it's not, because we do need this research, and it's very important that we compare the different types of proteins so we don't have any confounders or things that kind of mess up the outcomes that we get that may kind of contribute to something. So these are really important that we do these first before we kind of go into kind of more real world scenario and practical applications. So like I said, when you consume whey protein in a fasted state, so when subjects come into the lab and they consume it fasted, they get this response to muscle protein synthesis that will be, that will onset around 45 to 90 minutes, and it will kind of peak soon thereafter, and then it will stay elevated for quite a while. So if you train and you have whey protein before you train, and let's say your training is like 2 hours long or 1.5 hours, likely, even if you just consume whey protein by itself, you will have peak levels of muscle protein synthesis right after you finish training. So throughout your whole training, you'll be peaking in muscle protein synthesis levels. So the necessity of having another peak of whey protein right after you train is probably negated. And actually, some work by Dr. Kevin Tipton and his colleagues in the UK have showed that having protein before you train negates kind of the benefit of having an additional amount or having an equal amount post workout. So we really need to take this into context that most people don't train in a completely fasted state. In addition to this, most people don't just consume whey protein pre-workout. They'll have some food like normal people. They'll have breakfast, or they'll have lunch, or they'll have some sort of mixed meal, or maybe they'll have whey protein, but they'll consume it with like oats or porridge or something else. The reality is we don't really know how this affects muscle protein synthesis, but likely it prolongs it. So there was some research done in mixed meal composition and its effects on muscle protein synthesis. And what they found was that when consuming minced meat, that peak amino acid levels only occurred after 4 hours. So we can't really have a one-to-one correlation with muscle protein synthesis and amino acid levels in the blood, but we cannot completely negate that either. There's definitely some relationship between those two. So most likely, because of foods, depending on what you eat, and that's why it's really hard to give exact context, because some people eat different things. Some people have higher fat, some people have more fiber, some people have more carbs, some people have different types of protein sources. That these are all going to affect the digestion and absorption of the nutrients in your stomach or in your small intestine. That's then going to have a knock-on effect on muscle protein synthesis levels. So it's very difficult to say that this is the perfect way to follow or the perfect type of protein to have before you train. But what we do know is that muscle protein synthesis is elongated, or it takes longer to peak when you consume a mixed meal. Work by Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, who's one of the most prolific researchers in muscle building, has shown that doesn't seem to really be any kind of post-workout anabolic window when all protein levels in subjects are matched. And the reason is probably because it's not just eating protein itself that actually increases muscle protein synthesis, but training does as well. So like I said, with muscle protein synthesis response from eating protein, whey protein specifically, we'll get this like increase at like 90 minutes and it will last for a couple of hours. But with training, it actually elevated for 48 hours and probably even longer. I think it's around 32% above baseline at 48 hours, and it's around 64% after 24 hours. So it has this synergistic effect. So what Schoenfeld and his colleagues show that is, if you have whey protein, a few hours after you train, and he did a meta-analysis on this, which is a pooled basically study of all the different research looking at this. He said when you have whey protein or a protein source a few hours after rather than directly after, there doesn't seem to be any difference. Now, this is probably even further nullified if someone has a pre-workout meal because of these amino acid levels. So like I said, depending on the pre-workout meal that you have and the time or how far before your training and how long your training was, that's really going to then determine whether what your protein source should be. So example, if you have a mixed meal, like I mentioned with the minced meat, maybe if you have that at 12 o'clock, train at 2 o'clock, you finish your training at 3 o'clock, those amino acid levels are peaking 1 hour after you finish your training. So, adding more protein on top of that probably isn't going to peak muscle protein synthesis levels any higher. Whereas on the other end of the spectrum, if you wake up in the morning and you train fasted because you train straight away and you don't like to eat, muscle protein breakdown will be increased above muscle protein synthesis, even though muscle protein synthesis still, you still get a response from training alone. If you do not eat anything, muscle protein breakdown will supersede the muscle protein synthesis effect, and you'll be in a net muscle protein breakdown state post-training. So then it does become important that somebody does have something sooner after you train. So some people will hypothesize that we need to consume whey protein because we spike muscle protein synthesis levels really fast, like I mentioned at the start of this video. And yes, that makes sense in a fasted state, but people who are trying to maximize their progress or muscle building very rarely are in fasted states after they train or before they train. They're going to be eating frequently, every 4 hours, every 5 hours, or even sooner than that. So likely they'll have muscle protein synthesis levels that are going to be elevated almost all of the time, because you have, like, let's say you have a slow digesting protein for breakfast. You have like eggs with some fat and some carbs. That's slow. It gets slowed down. Then for lunch you have beef or chicken or something that's slower than whey protein, and along with other foods that you have with that, it gets slowed down. So we start to see this overlap between muscle protein synthesis and different meals. It doesn't really kind of pan out as perfectly as just it peaks and then it goes down, peaks and goes down. Well, there is research by Dr. Stu Phillips over in Canada showing that if you just consume whey protein a couple of times a day, you do see these peaks and troughs of muscle protein synthesis. But nobody consumes just whey protein as their meals without any other food. It just doesn't make sense. You'll be severely nutrient deficient and you'll have some serious health problems if you do that. So what we currently know with the research is that overall protein intake is going to be the most important thing. It's probably a good idea to have something before you train in terms of protein source and potentially carb source, because we don't want muscle protein breakdown levels to be increased much higher than muscle protein synthesis levels. If you eat something before you train, it probably becomes less important to have something after you train. But at the same time, at some point, muscle protein synthesis levels will start to come back down. So we do want to have something at some point. So it really context depending. If you have a slower digesting protein before you train, you probably don't need to eat as soon as you can after training. If you have something really fast digesting, like just whey by itself, 2 hours before you train, it's probably a good idea to have whey protein directly after you train. But in general, the consensus amongst the scientific community is that just hitting your overall protein intake, probably splitting it up to 3 to 5 meals per day, eating animal protein sources, or if you eat only vegan sources, mixing various types of plant proteins will help you reach your essential amino acid level and your the optimal leucine amounts per meal, and you will be doing best. So I know this video is kind of long and you didn't really get any definitive answers whether it's the best or it's the worst. I think from a personal perspective, taking all of this research into account, looking at it from like a physiology point of view and how it digests, absorbs, as well as a practical point of view, I think just focusing on recommendations of having something before 1 to 2 hours, or perhaps even longer than 1 to 2 hours, depending on the type of protein, and then something 1 to 2 hours after you train, and that can be a mixed meal. It doesn't necessarily have to be whey protein. Then you're going to be maximizing the benefits. There's really no research to show that in the context of a normal living diet or a normal diet that people eat, that you need to consume a whey protein straight after you work out. Just to kind of give some personal opinion as well. Of course, the whole video is pretty much personal opinion, but to give some personal opinion on, people who do have whey protein and think that you need to have it, often they'll consume that with like oats, or they'll consume it with some other food. Then it kind of negates the benefit of the fast digesting action of whey protein and its muscle protein synthetic response, if there is any benefit in that case, because having it with some other food will affect the digestion dynamics of it. So I personally am trying to maximize all my progress with my clients, trying to maximize their progress, following those rules, having something before and after 1 to 2 hours either side of your training. If it's whey protein, great. Whey protein is probably one of the most cost-effective sources of protein that you can get. It's cheaper than a lot of foods in terms of grams. But focusing on or buying like hydrolyzed whey protein, or very expensive isolate protein, these are pretty much not going to have any difference at all. So hopefully you found this video useful. There's some practical advice that you can take away from this. If you do have any questions on this, because I know there can be loads of questions and scenarios that can stem from this, ask them or drop them down below, and I would be happy to have a discussion or to give you some advice. If there's anything else, any other videos or content you want to see, please also let me know. And if you want, please go ahead and subscribe for more of this content.